Felix Rourke sat in his darkened garage at 11:30, pretending to fix his truck while listening to his wife through the thin kitchen wall. The wrench felt cold in his calloused hands as Maren's voice drifted through the night air, sweet as poison honey. "If you don't like that I'm social, then maybe you should leave," she said into her phone, followed by that laugh, the one she used to reserve for him, back when they were young and stupid enough to believe in forever. Felix grinned in the darkness, a mirthless expression that would have worried anyone who knew him well. "Someone needs to leave," he whispered to the empty garage, "but it's not going to be me." 22 years of marriage, and it had come to this, hiding in his own garage, eavesdropping on his wife's conversations like some pathetic stalker. But Felix had learned something important in his 43 years on this earth. Sometimes you had to become pathetic to survive the people who were supposed to love you. The phone call ended with more of that laughter, and Felix heard Maren's heels clicking across the kitchen tiles. Probably getting herself another glass of that expensive wine she'd started buying, the kind that cost more than his weekly grocery budget. Everything about Maren had gotten expensive lately, from her clothes to her attitude. He waited until her footsteps faded up the stairs before emerging from the garage. The kitchen still smelled like her perfume, something French and complicated that replaced the simple vanilla scent she used to wear. Even her smell had upgraded, leaving him behind like everything else in her life. Felix opened the refrigerator and grabbed a beer, the cheap kind that came in cans instead of bottles. He sat at the kitchen table, their kitchen table, though it felt more like enemy territory these days, and tried to remember when things had started going wrong. Maybe it was when Maren got promoted to senior associate at the law firm. Maybe it was when their daughter Sophie started college and stopped needing them as much. Or maybe it was just the slow erosion that happened to marriages when people stopped trying to be the person their spouse fell in love with. His phone buzzed against the table, a text from his buddy Rick at the gym. "You coming in tomorrow? Need someone to hold pads." Felix typed back, "Yeah, might need to hit something." "Rough night?" "Every night's rough lately." "Bring extra wraps, I got new heavy bag." Felix smiled, the first genuine expression he'd worn all day. Rick understood the language of men who worked with their hands and fixed things that were broken. Too bad marriages weren't as simple as engines or plumbing. Upstairs, he could hear Maren moving around their bedroom. Their bedroom, another joke. They'd been sleeping on opposite sides of a king-size bed for months, a canyon of cold sheets between them. She went to bed with her laptop. He went to bed with whatever paperback thriller he was reading. Two people sharing space, but not sharing anything that mattered. Felix finished his beer and headed upstairs, each step creaking under his weight. The house was old, bought when they were young and optimistic, when they thought they'd fill it with kids and laughter and all the things that made life worth living. Sophie had been their only child, and now she was gone, leaving them alone with their disappointments. Maren was in the bathroom, going through her elaborate nighttime routine. Felix could see her reflection in the mirror, carefully applying some cream that probably cost more than his work boots. She caught his eye in the reflection, but didn't smile. "How was your day?" he asked, because that's what husbands were supposed to ask. "Fine," she said, because that's what wives were supposed to say when they didn't want to talk to their husbands. Felix nodded and started getting ready for bed. He brushed his teeth with the generic toothpaste while she used something organic and whitening. He washed his face with bar soap while she had a dozen bottles of various cleansers and treatments. Even their bathroom routines had become a study in contrasts. "I might be late tomorrow," Maren said, not looking at him. "Meeting with a new client." "What kind of case?" "Corporate stuff. You wouldn't find it interesting." Another wall, another dismissal. Felix had stopped trying to understand the legal work that consumed her life, partly because she never explained it in terms he could understand, and partly because he'd started to suspect she enjoyed having something he couldn't share. They climbed into bed on their respective sides, Maren with her laptop and Felix with his book. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with all the things they weren't saying to each other. "Felix?" Maren said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Yeah? We should probably talk, soon, about things." His stomach clenched, but his voice stayed steady. "What kind of things?" "Just things, the way we've been living, whether this is what we both want." Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. Felix closed his book and looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. She was still beautiful at 41, maybe more beautiful than when they'd met. Success had given her a confidence that was attractive, even if it came with a coldness that hadn't been there before. "Is this what you want?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her laptop screen. "I don't know anymore. I just know I'm not happy." "And you think that's my fault?" "I think it's nobody's fault. Maybe we just grew apart." Felix wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways he'd tried to bridge the gap between them, all the conversations she'd shut down and the invitations she'd declined. But he was tired of fighting battles he couldn't win. "Okay," he said. "We'll talk." Maren nodded and went back to her laptop. Felix opened his book but couldn't focus on the words. Instead, he found himself thinking about that phone conversation he'd overheard, about the way she'd laughed for someone else, about the meeting with a new client that she wouldn't describe. Maybe he was paranoid. Maybe 22 years of marriage had made him suspicious of shadows and imagined threats. But Felix had learned to trust his instincts, especially when those instincts were telling him that the woman lying next to him was already gone. He closed the book and turned off his bedside lamp. In the darkness, he could hear Maren's fingers tapping on her keyboard, probably texting someone who made her laugh the way she used to laugh with him. "Good night," he said. "Night," she replied, not looking up from her screen. Felix closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept turning over the conversation, looking for clues he might have missed. One thing was certain. When Maren said they needed to talk about things, she wasn't talking about fixing their marriage. She was talking about ending it. The question was whether he was going to let her do it on her terms, or whether he was going to have something to say about how this story ended. Friday night at Donovan's bar, and Felix sat nursing his second beer while watching his wife work the room like a politician at a fundraiser. She'd changed after work, swapping her conservative lawyer uniform for a black dress that hugged curves he hadn't been invited to touch in months. Her hair was down, loose and shining under the bar's dim lights, and she was laughing that laugh again, the one that used to be his. "She's really putting on a show tonight," Rick said, sliding into the booth across from him. Rick Martinez owned the boxing gym where Felix spent his lunch breaks hitting things, and he had the kind of blunt honesty that came from taking too many punches to the head. "It's a work thing," Felix said, though they both knew it wasn't. "Work thing, huh? That why she's giving her number to every guy with a pulse?" Felix's grip tightened on his beer bottle. "What are you talking about?" Rick jerked his chin toward the bar. "Been watching for 10 minutes. She's handed out more digits than a phone book. That guy in the blue shirt? Got her number. The one with the beard? Got her number. Even that kid who looks like he should be carded. Yep, got her number too." Felix followed Rick's gaze and felt something cold settle in his chest. Maren was leaning against the bar, smiling up at a man in an expensive suit who was clearly not from their neighborhood. As Felix watched, she pulled out her phone and began typing, presumably entering the man's contact information. "Maybe she's networking," Felix said, but the words tasted like ash. "Sure," Rick said, "and I'm training for the Olympics." Felix stood up abruptly. "I need some air." "Felix, wait." but he was already moving, pushing through the crowd toward the exit. Outside, the October air was sharp and clean, a relief after the stale atmosphere of the bar. He pulled out his phone and called Sophie. "Hey, Dad." His daughter's voice was bright, untainted by the poison that seemed to infect everything else in his life. "What's up?" "Just wanted to hear your voice, kiddo. How's school?" "Brutal. I've got 3 papers due next week and a presentation that's going to crush my soul, but other than that, living the dream." Felix smiled despite everything. Sophie had inherited his sense of humor along with Maren's intelligence, a combination that would serve her well in life, assuming she didn't also inherit their talent for destroying the people they were supposed to love. "Your mom's out networking tonight," he said, testing the words. "Cool. She's been working really hard lately. I'm glad she's taking time to have some fun." Fun? Is that what they were calling it now? "Dad, you okay? You sound weird." "Just tired, sweetheart. Long week." "Well, get some sleep. And tell Mom I said hi when you see her." "I will. Love you, Soph." "Love you too, Dad." Felix hung up and stood in the parking lot, watching people come and go from the bar. Normal people, living normal lives, probably not standing outside in the cold, wondering if their marriages were dissolving while they watched. His phone buzzed. A text from Maren. "Going for coffee with some colleagues. Don't wait up." Coffee. At 10:30 on a Friday night. With colleagues who apparently included every man she'd met at the bar. Felix typed back, "Have fun." Then he got in his truck and drove home, his mind spinning with possibilities he didn't want to consider. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation for everything he'd witnessed. Maybe his wife of 22 years wasn't systematically collecting phone numbers like some kind of romantic scavenger hunt. But as he pulled into their driveway, Felix realized he didn't believe in maybes anymore. He believed in evidence, and the evidence was starting to paint a picture he didn't like. Inside the house, he went to their bedroom and opened Maren's laptop. It was password protected, but he knew her passwords, their anniversary, Sophie's birthday, the name of her first dog. She'd never been particularly creative about security. Her email was open, and Felix felt like a criminal as he scrolled through her messages. Most of it was work-related, but there were several exchanges that made his stomach clench. Messages with men he didn't recognize, conversations that started professional but quickly became personal. One thread in particular caught his attention. A back and forth with someone named Lance Morrison, full of inside jokes and casual intimacy that felt like a punch to the gut. Lance: "Can't wait to see you again. Last time was incredible." Maren: "Me too. Felix is working late tomorrow, so we should have plenty of time." Felix: "Working late tomorrow." The timestamp was from 3 days ago. Wednesday night, when Maren had said she was having dinner with her friend Hannah. When Felix had worked late at the shop, trying to finish a transmission job so he could surprise her by coming home early. He'd come home to an empty house and a note saying she'd decided to stay overnight at Hannah's because they'd had too much wine to drive. He'd been worried about her, had even called to make sure she was okay. Hannah had answered, confirming that Maren was there and safe. Now he wondered if Hannah was part of the lie, or if Maren had been somewhere else entirely. Felix closed the laptop and sat on the edge of their bed, trying to process what he'd learned. His wife was having an affair, maybe multiple affairs. She was lying to him, lying to their daughter, lying to everyone who thought they were still the happy couple they'd pretended to be for so long. The rational part of his brain told him to confront her, to demand an explanation, to try to work things out like adults. But another part of him, a part that had been growing stronger over the past few months, wanted something else entirely. He wanted her to pay for what she was doing to their family. He wanted her to understand what it felt like to be humiliated and betrayed. He wanted her to learn that actions had consequences, even for successful lawyers who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Felix went downstairs and poured himself a drink. Not beer this time, but whiskey, the good stuff they kept for special occasions. He supposed this qualified as special in its own twisted way. His phone rang. Maren. "Hi," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "Hey, I just wanted to let you know I'm going to stay at Hannah's tonight. We're having such a good time, and I've had too much coffee to drive safely." Coffee that required staying overnight. Coffee that made her giggle like a teenager in the background of their phone call. "Okay," Felix said. "Drive safe tomorrow." "I will. Love you." The words were automatic, meaningless. Felix wondered if she even heard herself saying them anymore, or if lying had become so natural that she didn't distinguish between truth and fiction. "Love you too," he said, because that's what husbands were supposed to say, even when their wives were probably in bed with men whose names they'd collected at bars. After she hung up, Felix sat in his kitchen and made a decision. He wasn't going to confront Maren about her affairs. He wasn't going to beg her to choose him over her new life. He wasn't going to play the role of the devastated husband who fought for a marriage that was already over. Instead, he was going to do something else. Something that would teach his wife and her lovers that Felix Rourke wasn't the kind of man you could discard without consequences. He finished his whiskey and went upstairs to pack. Saturday morning found Felix in his garage, methodically loading Maren's belongings into garbage bags and cardboard boxes. 22 years of shared life reduced to containers that would fit in the back of his pickup truck. Her clothes, her books, her collection of expensive face creams, everything that marked their bedroom as hers rather than theirs. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger was hot and messy and made you do stupid things. What Felix felt now was cold and precise, like the moment before you threw a perfect punch in the ring. Everything slowed down, and you could see exactly where to strike for maximum impact. His phone buzzed. A text from Maren. "Having brunch with Hannah, home around 2. Felix checked his watch. That gave him 3 hours to finish his preparations. He'd spent the early morning hours researching Lance Morrison, and what he'd found was interesting. Lance owned a small advertising agency downtown, the kind of trendy operation that called itself a creative collective, and charged premium prices for what used to be called making commercials. His social media was full of artfully arranged photos of expensive coffee and inspirational quotes about following your passion. More importantly, Lance was married. His wife Jennifer was a pediatric nurse who posted pictures of their golden retriever and their weekend hiking trips. She looked like the kind of woman who believed in marriage vows and wouldn't appreciate learning that her husband was collecting phone numbers at bars. Felix had also done some digging on Hannah Reeves, Maren's supposed best friend and alibi provider. Hannah was a paralegal at a different firm, recently divorced, with a history of social media posts that suggested she had strong opinions about men in general and husbands in particular. Her recent posts were full of empowering messages about women taking control of their lives and not settling for less than they deserved. It was starting to make sense. Hannah wasn't just providing cover for Maren's affairs, she was encouraging them, maybe even orchestrating them. The recently divorced friend who wanted company in her misery, who whispered poison in Maren's ear about how she deserved better than her blue-collar husband. Felix loaded the last box into his truck and checked his watch again. Time for Phase 1. Café Luna was the kind of place that served $15 salads and had more varieties of milk than most grocery stores. It was also where Lance Morrison had his regular Saturday coffee meeting with potential clients, according to his very public social media schedule. Felix found a parking spot across the street and waited. At exactly 11:30, Lance walked in, just as his Instagram story had promised. He was younger than Felix had expected, maybe 35, with the kind of carefully maintained scruff that probably required expensive grooming products. He wore jeans that cost more than Felix made in a day, and a leather jacket that screamed, "creative professional." Felix gave him 10 minutes to get settled, then started unloading boxes from his truck. The cafe had large windows that faced the street, perfect for people watching and being watched. Felix could see Lance at a table near the window, scrolling through his phone while he waited for whatever client or conquest he was meeting. Felix carried the first box across the street and set it down on the sidewalk directly in front of Lance's table. Then, he went back for the second box and the third, building a small mountain of Maren's possessions on the public sidewalk. By the time he brought over the garbage bags full of clothes, Lance had noticed the commotion and was staring through the window with obvious confusion. Other cafe patrons were starting to notice too, craning their necks to see what was happening outside. Felix's phone rang. Maren. "Perfect timing," he said aloud, then answered. "Hey, honey." "Felix, what are you doing? I just got a call from Sarah Chen. She said you're making some kind of scene downtown." Sarah Chen. Another lawyer from Maren's firm, probably having her own Saturday coffee date and recognizing the show playing out on the sidewalk. "Just delivering some things to their rightful owner," Felix said, loud enough for his voice to carry through the cafe windows. "Thought you might need your stuff, since you're spending so much time away from home." "What are you talking about? Felix, you're scaring me." "Am I? That's funny because I'm not the one who's been lying for months." Through the window, Felix could see Lance starting to understand what was happening. The man's face had gone pale, and he was looking around the cafe like he wanted to disappear. "Felix, please, can we talk about this at home? You're embarrassing yourself." "I'm embarrassing myself?" Felix laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "That's rich, coming from someone who handed out her phone number to half the bar last night." Silence on the other end of the line. Felix used the pause to pull out the folder he'd prepared, printouts of Maren's email exchanges, her text messages, her social media activity, everything he'd found during his late-night investigation. "I've got some reading material for you," he said into the phone, "and for your friend Lance. I think you'll find it fascinating." He walked into the cafe, his work boots loud on the polished concrete floor. Lance was trying to pretend he wasn't involved, but his hands were shaking as he lifted his coffee cup. "Lance Morrison?" Felix said, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. Lance looked up, his face a mask of forced confusion. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" "We have a mutual friend," Felix said, dropping the folder on Lance's table. "My wife, Maren. I thought you might enjoy reading some of your correspondence with her." The cafe had gone completely quiet. Felix could feel every eye in the place watching the drama unfold, could see phones being raised to record what was obviously about to become social media gold. "I don't know what you're talking about," Lance said, but his voice cracked on the words. "Really? Because according to these emails, you know my wife pretty well. Intimately, you might say." Felix opened the folder and pulled out one of the printed conversations, laying it on the table where Lance and everyone else could see it. The text was clear enough to read from several tables away, and Felix watched as understanding rippled through the cafe. "You're insane," Lance whispered. "Maybe," Felix said, "but I'm not a liar, unlike some people in this room." He pulled out his keys, Maren's keys, which he'd quietly removed from her purse the night before, and dropped them on the table next to the emails. "Tell my wife she can pick up her house keys when she's ready to have an honest conversation," Felix said. "Until then, she's welcome to stay wherever she's been spending her nights." Felix walked out of the cafe, leaving Lance sitting at his table with a folder full of evidence and a cafe full of witnesses. Behind him, he could hear the buzz of conversation starting up again, could imagine the photos and videos that were already being uploaded to social media. His phone was ringing. Maren, probably, but he didn't answer. Instead, he got in his truck and drove home, feeling lighter than he had in months. Phase 1 was complete. Now it was time to see how his wife and her lover handled being exposed to the light. The first video appeared on Facebook within an hour. Felix watched it from his living room, a beer in his hand and a grim smile on his face, as someone's shaky phone footage captured his dramatic exit from Cafe Luna. The comments were already pouring in, neighbors and acquaintances who recognized him and Maren, strangers who just loved a good public meltdown. Holy cow, is that Felix Rourke? OMG, I know his wife, she's a lawyer downtown. That man just destroyed someone's entire life in 5 minutes. Plot twist. The husband fights back. Felix's phone had been buzzing constantly since he got home, but he ignored it. Let Maren sweat for a while. Let her figure out how to explain this to her friends, her colleagues, her daughter. Sophie. Felix's stomach clenched as he realized his daughter would probably see this mess online before he had a chance to explain. He needed to call her, needed to control that narrative before someone else did. But first, he wanted to see how Lance Morrison handled being exposed. Felix didn't have to wait long. His doorbell rang at 4:30, and through the window, he could see a familiar figure pacing on his front porch. Lance had traded his expensive casual wear for a wrinkled button-down and khakis, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days instead of hours. Felix opened the door, but didn't invite him in. "Can I help you?" "We need to talk," Lance said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Do we? I thought I said everything I needed to say at the cafe." "Look, I know you're upset, but this has gotten way out of hand. That video is everywhere. My wife has seen it. My business partners have seen it. You've ruined my life over a misunderstanding." Felix leaned against the doorframe, studying the younger man. Lance was handsome in that generic way that women seem to like. Clean-shaven, well-groomed, the kind of guy who probably spent more on hair products than Felix spent on groceries. But up close, he looked soft, pampered, like someone who'd never had to fight for anything real. "Misunderstanding?" Felix said. "That's an interesting way to describe an affair with my wife." "It wasn't an affair. We're friends, that's all. Business contacts. The emails you found were taken out of context." Felix reached into his back pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he brought up one of the email threads he'd screenshotted the night before. "Let me read you some context," Felix said. "Can't wait to feel your hands on me again. That was from my wife to you, 3 days ago. Next time, let's get a room with a better view." That was your response. Should I keep going? Lance's face went white. "How did you—" "She said you never checked her email. She said a lot of things that turned out to be lies. Amazing how that works." Lance ran his hands through his hair, destroying whatever expensive styling he'd started the day with. "Look, okay, maybe we got carried away. But it's not what you think. Maren and I, we connect on an intellectual level. We understand each other in ways that her husband of 22 years couldn't possibly understand." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to. It's written all over your face." Felix stepped closer, and Lance automatically stepped back. "Let me tell you something about understanding, Lance. I understand that you're a coward who goes after married women because you're too weak to handle a real relationship. I understand that you're probably cheating on your own wife while you're busy stealing mine. And I understand that you're about to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong family. Are you threatening me?" Felix smiled, and something in his expression made Lance take another step back. "I don't make threats, Lance. I make promises. And here's my promise to you. This is just the beginning. You wanted to play games with my marriage? Fine. Let's play." Lance looked around nervously, as if he expected neighbors to be watching from their windows, which they probably were. The video from the cafe had made Felix and his situation the hottest gossip in their small city. "What do you want?" Lance asked. "Money? I can pay you to keep this quiet." "Keep it quiet?" Felix laughed. "Son, I'm just getting started with making noise, but since you asked what I want, I'll tell you. I want you to stay away from my wife. I want you to delete her number from your phone. And I want you to explain to your wife Jennifer why she's been getting sympathy calls from strangers all afternoon." Lance's face went even paler. "You contacted Jennifer?" "I didn't have to. The internet did that for me. Turns out your wife has Facebook, and several helpful strangers tagged her in the cafe video. She's been calling you for hours, by the way. Might want to answer your phone. As if summoned by Felix's words, Lance's phone started ringing. He looked at the screen and visibly flinched. That's probably her now, Felix said helpfully. Better run along and do some damage control. And Lance, if I find out you've had any contact with Maren after today, our next conversation won't be nearly as friendly. Lance turned and practically ran to his car, fumbling with his keys as his phone continued to ring. Felix watched him drive away, then went back inside to call his daughter. Sophie answered on the second ring. Dad, what the heck is going on? My roommate just sent me a video of you having some kind of breakdown at a coffee shop. It wasn't a breakdown, sweetheart. It was more like a breakthrough. Dad, this isn't funny. People are saying Mom was having an affair. Please tell me that's not true. Felix closed his eyes. Sophie was 19, old enough to handle the truth, but young enough that it would hurt her in ways she wouldn't understand for years. Your mother and I are having some problems, he said carefully. We've been growing apart for a while and things came to a head today. But was she cheating on you? The question hung in the air between them. Felix could lie, could protect Sophie from the ugly reality of what her mother had become. But lies were what had gotten them into this mess in the first place. Yes, he said. She was. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was small and hurt. How long have you known? I suspected for a while, but I only got proof last night. And you decided to humiliate her in public instead of talking to her about it? Felix felt a stab of guilt. Sophie, I tried talking to your mother for months. She wasn't interested in listening. So you thought embarrassing her on social media was the answer? I thought she needed to understand that her actions have consequences. Another long pause. Dad, I love you, but this is messed up. You can't just destroy someone's reputation because you're hurt. Can't I? She destroyed our family because she was bored. That doesn't make what you did right. Felix rubbed his forehead, feeling suddenly exhausted. Maybe not, but it felt right in the moment. Well, now what? Are you getting divorced? I don't know, kiddo. That's up to your mother. Have you even talked to her since this morning? Felix looked at his phone, which showed 17 missed calls from Maren. Not yet. Dad, you need to call her. Whatever she did, she's still my mother, and she's probably terrified right now. She should be. Dad. The disappointment in Sophie's voice cut deeper than any accusation could have. Felix had always been the stable parent, the one who stayed calm in crisis, who fixed things instead of breaking them. Now his daughter was seeing a side of him that he wasn't sure he liked either. Okay, he said. I'll call her. And Dad? Maybe think about talking to someone, a counselor or something. This whole situation is bigger than just you and Mom. After Sophie hung up, Felix sat in his quiet house and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The man in the cafe that morning had felt powerful, in control, finally taking action instead of passively accepting betrayal. But the man sitting alone in his living room felt small and petty, like someone who'd won a battle by burning down the entire battlefield. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Jennifer Morrison. We need to talk. Felix stared at the message, realizing that the consequences of his actions were spreading in ways he hadn't anticipated. Lance's wife wanted to talk, which meant she'd probably learned about her husband's affair the same way Felix had learned about Maren's, through public humiliation and social media exposure. Another text, this one from Rick. Saw the video. You okay, man? And another from his neighbor. If you need anything, we're here for you. And another from a number he didn't recognize. Way to show that cheating witch who's boss. Felix turned off his phone and poured himself another drink. Tomorrow, he would deal with the aftermath of what he'd started. Tonight, he just wanted to sit in his quiet house and pretend that revenge felt as good as he'd thought it would. Felix woke up Sunday morning to the sound of his doorbell ringing insistently. He stumbled downstairs in his bathrobe, expecting to find another confrontation with Lance, or maybe Maren herself, finally ready to face the music. Instead, he found Jennifer Morrison standing on his porch, holding a coffee carrier, and looking like she hadn't slept in 2 days. She was smaller than he'd expected from her social media photos, with short brown hair and tired eyes that held a familiar mixture of hurt and anger. "Mr. Rourke, I'm Jennifer Morrison. I think we need to talk." Felix looked past her, half expecting to see Lance lurking in the background, but she appeared to be alone. "Mrs. Morrison, I wasn't expecting you." "I brought coffee," she said, holding up the carrier. "I figured we both probably need it." Felix studied her for a moment, then stepped aside to let her in. She moved through his house like someone who was used to taking charge of difficult situations, probably a skill that came with being a nurse. "Nice place," she said, settling onto his couch and handing him one of the coffees. "Very different from Lance's aesthetic." "Lance has been here?" "No, but I've seen his Instagram. Everything's very curated, very lifestyle brand. This feels more like a home." Felix sat down across from her, still trying to figure out what she wanted. "I'm sorry about yesterday. I know this situation has to be difficult for you." Jennifer laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Difficult is one word for it. I spent yesterday fielding phone calls from friends who saw that video, explaining to my mother why strangers were sending me sympathy messages on Facebook, and listening to my husband lie to my face about his business relationship with your wife. He's still denying it? Oh, he admitted to the affair eventually, after I showed him the screenshots that half the internet had already seen. But he's trying to minimize it, make it sound like some kind of emotional connection that got out of hand. Felix took a sip of his coffee. It was good, better than the instant stuff he'd been drinking since Maren started buying the expensive beans for herself. "What do you want from me, Mrs. Morrison?" "Jennifer. And I want the truth. All of it. Because I have a feeling this thing between our spouses goes deeper than just some casual fling." Felix considered how much to tell her. Jennifer seemed like a straight shooter, someone who could handle the truth, but he didn't know her well enough to trust her completely. "How much do you know about your husband's business?" he asked. "Enough to know that it's not as successful as he pretends it is. Why?" "Because I think this whole thing started as more than just an affair. I think Lance targeted my wife specifically." Jennifer's eyes sharpened. "What do you mean?" Felix got up and retrieved the folder he'd prepared the day before, the one he'd left with Lance at the cafe. He'd made copies of everything, knowing he might need them later. "Your husband didn't just meet my wife at a bar," Felix said, spreading out the printed emails and text messages. "He'd been researching her for weeks before they made contact. Look at this." He showed Jennifer a series of LinkedIn searches and social media interactions that painted a picture of deliberate stalking rather than chance encounter. Lance looked up Maren's law firm, her cases, her social circle. He started following her on Instagram and Twitter, liking her posts, making himself visible in her digital world before he ever approached her in person. Jennifer studied the papers, her expression growing darker. "This is from Lance's computer?" "His email account, yeah. He wasn't very careful about covering his tracks." "How did you get access to his email?" Felix hesitated. "Let's just say your husband uses the same password for everything, and he's not as smart as he thinks he is." Jennifer looked up at him. "You hacked his email." "I investigated my wife's affair and followed the evidence where it led me." "That's illegal." "So is adultery in some states." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, reading through more of the correspondence. My God, he was planning this whole thing. Look at this message. He's talking about her financial situation, her husband's income, whether she'd be financially vulnerable in a divorce. Felix leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Lance has done this before. Not the affair part. At least, I don't think so. But the targeting wealthy women part. His advertising business is mostly a front. He makes his real money by getting close to women with assets, then finding ways to separate them from their money. Are you saying he's some kind of con artist? I'm saying my husband has a very expensive lifestyle that his legitimate business can't support, and I've been wondering for months where the extra money was coming from. Felix felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of extra money? Jennifer pulled out her phone and showed him a banking app. Our joint account has been getting regular deposits that Lance claims are from new clients, but when I ask for details, he gets vague. 5,000 here, 10,000 there, always in cash. You think he's been blackmailing the women he has affairs with? I think he's been doing something, and I think your wife might not be his first victim. Felix stared at the evidence spread across his coffee table, seeing his situation in a completely new light. What he'd thought was a simple affair, his wife's midlife crisis, her rejection of their marriage, might actually be something much more calculated and dangerous. There's something else, Jennifer said. Lance has been getting phone calls at weird hours, always stepping outside to take them, and last week I found a burner phone in his car. Did you confront him about it? I was planning to, but then yesterday happened and everything exploded. Felix's mind was racing, putting together pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed. Jennifer, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay. Do you think Lance is dangerous? I mean physically dangerous? Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. A year ago, I would have said no. Lance is a lot of things, but he's not violent. But lately, he's been different. Paranoid, aggressive, talking about people who don't understand him and don't appreciate what he's trying to build. And some of the phone calls I've overheard have been pretty intense. Intense how? Threatening, like he was trying to intimidate someone. Felix felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Mrs. Morrison, Jennifer, I think we both need to be very careful about how we handle this situation. What do you mean? I mean, if your husband is running some kind of con game, and if I've just exposed it publicly, then we might both be in more danger than we realized. As if summoned by his words, Felix's phone started ringing. The caller ID showed Maren's number. That's my wife, he said. Answer it, Jennifer said. Put it on speaker. I want to hear what she has to say. Felix hesitated, then accepted the call and put it on speakerphone. Felix, thank God. Maren's voice filled the room tight with panic. We need to talk, right now. I'm listening. Not on the phone, in person. There are things you don't understand, things that are more complicated than you realize. Such as? Such as the fact that Lance Morrison isn't who he says he is, and you may have just put both of us in serious danger by exposing him. Felix looked at Jennifer, who had gone pale. What kind of danger, Maren? The kind where we need to call the police. How soon can you meet me? Where are you? Somewhere safe, for now. But Felix, if Lance contacts you, don't meet with him alone. Promise me. Felix thought about Lance's visit the previous afternoon, about the desperation in the man's voice and the panic in his eyes. At the time, he'd interpreted it as the fear of a cheater who'd been exposed. Now he wondered if it had been something much more dangerous. Maren, are you saying Lance threatened you? I'm saying Lance has been lying to both of us about everything, and now that his cover is blown, I don't know what he's capable of. Jennifer grabbed Felix's arm. Ask her about the money, she whispered. Maren, has Lance been asking you for money? Loans, investments, anything like that? The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that Felix thought the call had dropped. Maren, we'll talk about it when I see you. 1 hour at the police station downtown. And Felix, bring everything you found on Lance's computer. We're going to need it. The call ended, leaving Felix and Jennifer staring at each other across a coffee table covered with evidence that had suddenly become much more important than proof of an affair. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" Jennifer whispered. Felix looked at the woman whose husband had been conning his wife, whose marriage had been destroyed by the same man who'd destroyed his, and realized they were about to find out. The police station parking lot felt like neutral territory, a place where the normal rules of marriage and betrayal temporarily didn't apply. Felix sat in his truck, watching Maren pace back and forth near the entrance, her phone pressed to her ear. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. Jennifer Morrison sat in the passenger seat beside him, clutching a manila folder full of her own evidence about Lance's financial irregularities. They'd spent the past hour comparing notes, building a picture of a man who was far more dangerous than either of them had realized. "She looks scared," Jennifer observed. "Maren doesn't scare easily," Felix said. "Whatever Lance has been doing, it must be serious." They got out of the truck and walked toward the station entrance. Maren saw them coming and ended her phone call, her face a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Felix," she said, then looked at Jennifer with obvious confusion. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met." "Jennifer Morrison," Jennifer said, extending her hand. "Lance's wife." Maren's face went white. "Oh, I didn't expect—" "Neither did I," Jennifer said. "But it turns out we have a lot more in common than just our husband's affair." Felix watched his wife struggle with the social dynamics of the situation. How did you greet the wife of the man you'd been sleeping with? What was the etiquette for a conversation that involved betrayal, possible criminal activity, and the collapse of two marriages simultaneously? "We should go inside," Maren said finally. "I've already spoken with Detective Rodriguez about the situation." They followed her into the station, through a maze of desks and uniformed officers, to a small conference room where a middle-aged detective was waiting with a laptop and several file folders. "Detective Rodriguez," Maren said, "this is my husband Felix, and this is Jennifer Morrison." Detective Rodriguez was a compact woman with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She gestured for them to sit around the conference table. "Mrs. Rourke has been telling me about Lance Morrison," the detective said, looking at Felix and Jennifer. "But I'd like to hear your perspectives as well. Mr. Rourke, let's start with what led you to investigate Mr. Morrison." Felix told the story of discovering Maren's affair, his decision to confront Lance publicly, and his subsequent investigation into Lance's background. He handed over copies of all the emails and text messages he'd found, watching Detective Rodriguez's expression grow more serious as she reviewed them. "And Mrs. Morrison," the detective said, turning to Jennifer, "you mentioned financial irregularities." Jennifer opened her folder and spread out bank statements, credit card bills, and other financial documents. "My husband has been receiving large cash deposits that he claims are from his advertising business, but the amounts don't match his reported income. And I found evidence that he's been using multiple credit cards and bank accounts that I didn't know about." Detective Rodriguez studied the documents, making notes on a legal pad. "Mrs. Rourke, you mentioned that Mr. Morrison had been asking you for money?" Maren looked uncomfortable, glancing at Felix before answering. "Lance said he was having cash flow problems with his business. He asked me to invest in a new project he was developing. Something about expanding into digital marketing." "How much money are we talking about?" $50,000. He said it would just be a short-term loan, that he'd pay it back with interest within 6 months. Felix felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. $50,000? Maren, we don't have $50,000 to loan anyone." "I know that," Maren said defensively. "That's why I told him no. But he kept pushing, saying that my legal contacts could help him land bigger clients, that it would be an investment in our future together." "Our future together?" Felix's voice was dangerously quiet. "Felix, please let me finish. When I refused to give him the money, Lance's whole personality changed. He became aggressive, demanding, started talking about how I owed him for the time and attention he'd invested in our relationship. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward. Did he threaten you, Mrs. Rourke? Not directly, but he made it clear that he had compromising photos and messages that could damage my reputation and my career if I didn't cooperate. Blackmail, Jennifer said flatly. He was blackmailing you. That's when I realized I was in over my head, Maren continued. I tried to end things with Lance, but he wouldn't accept it. He said he'd invested too much time in me to walk away empty-handed. Felix stared at his wife, seeing her clearly for the first time in months. So the affair wasn't about being unhappy with our marriage. It was about you being conned by a professional criminal. It started as an affair, Maren said quietly. I was unhappy, Felix. I felt trapped, like my life was smaller than I wanted it to be. When Lance showed interest in me, when he made me feel attractive and interesting and valued, I made a mistake. A mistake that nearly cost us $50,000. A mistake that could have cost us everything, Detective Rodriguez interjected. Based on what you've all told me, it sounds like Mr. Morrison has been running a sophisticated romance scam, targeting married women with assets and using a combination of seduction and blackmail to extract money from them. She opened one of her file folders and pulled out several photographs. We've been investigating Mr. Morrison for the past 3 months, based on complaints from women in 2 other cities. The pattern is always the same. He researches potential targets, initiates romantic relationships, then escalates to financial demands backed by threats of exposure. Felix looked at the photographs, recognizing Lance but also seeing several women he didn't know. All of them looked successful, professional, the kind of women who would have something to lose if their affairs became public. How many victims? Jennifer asked, her voice barely above a whisper. At least 6 that we know of, possibly more. Mr. Morrison has been very careful about covering his tracks, using multiple identities and operating in different cities to avoid detection. Multiple identities? Felix said. You mean Lance Morrison isn't his real name? Lance Morrison is one of at least 3 names he's been using. His real name is Larry Michaels, and he has a criminal record going back 15 years. Fraud, identity theft, extortion. Jennifer put her head in her hands. I've been married to a complete stranger. Mrs. Morrison, when was the last time you saw your husband? Yesterday afternoon, after he came back from confronting Mr. Rourke. He was packing a suitcase, said he had to go out of town for a business emergency. Detective Rodriguez and Felix exchanged glances. He came to see you yesterday? The detective asked Felix. Yeah, around 4:30. He was panicked, trying to convince me that the affair was just a misunderstanding. When I showed him that I had copies of his emails with Maren, he got desperate, started talking about paying me to keep quiet. Did he seem dangerous? Felix thought about Lance's demeanor, the way he'd kept looking around nervously, the panic in his voice. He seemed like a man who was cornered and running out of options. Detective Rodriguez closed her folders and looked around the table. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to put out a warrant for Larry Michaels, also known as Lance Morrison, on charges of fraud, extortion, and blackmail. Mrs. Morrison, we'll need you to come in tomorrow to give a formal statement about your husband's financial activities. Mrs. Rourke, we'll need the same from you regarding his attempts to extort money. What about us? Felix asked. Are we in any danger? Mr. Michaels typically runs when his cons are exposed, but he's never been outed as publicly as he was yesterday. The video from the cafe has been viewed thousands of times, and his photo is all over social media. He's trapped in a way he's never been before, which could make him unpredictable. The detective handed them each a business card. I want you all to be very careful over the next few days. Don't meet with anyone you don't know. Don't go anywhere alone if you can help it. And call me immediately if Mr. Michaels tries to contact any of you. As they left the police station, Felix found himself walking beside his wife for the first time in months. The anger he'd felt toward her had been replaced by something more complex. Relief that she hadn't chosen another man over him, guilt over his public humiliation of her, and uncertainty about what came next for their marriage. "Felix," Maren said as they reached their cars, "I know I don't have the right to ask, but could we talk? Privately?" Felix looked at Jennifer, who was getting into her own car. "Will you be okay?" "I'll be fine," Jennifer said. "I'm going to stay with my sister for a few days, until this whole thing is resolved." After Jennifer left, Felix and Maren stood in the parking lot, two people who'd been married for 22 years, but felt like strangers. "I'm sorry," Maren said, "for all of it. For the affair, for lying to you, for putting our family at risk." "I'm sorry too," Felix said, "for humiliating you in public, for not trusting you enough to talk to me about what you were going through. Where do we go from here?" Felix looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw the woman he'd fallen in love with 2 decades ago, underneath all the pain and mistakes and misunderstandings that had accumulated between them. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'd like to find out." As they stood there in the fading afternoon light, Felix's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This isn't over. You've cost me everything, and I'm going to make sure you pay for it." Felix showed the message to Maren, and they both understood that their reckoning with Lance Morrison, or Larry Michaels, or whoever he really was far from finished. 3 months later, Felix stood in his garage, working on his truck, while Maren sat at the kitchen table, visible through the open door. She was grading papers from the paralegal course she'd started taking, a career change that would let her help people navigate the legal system without the pressure and politics of her old law firm. Lance Morrison, whose real name turned out to be Larry Michaels, had been arrested in Phoenix 2 weeks after their meeting at the police station. He was currently awaiting trial on multiple charges of fraud and extortion, with victims in 4 different states. Jennifer Morrison had testified at his bail hearing, ensuring he remained locked up until his trial. The video of Felix's confrontation at Café Luna had eventually faded from social media, swallowed up by the endless churn of trending topics and fleeting scandals that people consumed and discarded like snacks. For a while, it had felt as if every glance from a neighbor carried judgment or pity, as if every whispered conversation in the grocery store must somehow be about them. But even small-town curiosity had an expiration date. Eventually, new gossip replaced the old, and life settled into a quieter rhythm, still familiar, but undeniably changed. It was a new kind of normal, one shaped by long nights of uncomfortable conversations and slow, careful rebuilding. "Felix," Maren called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the warm, domestic ease he hadn't heard from her in months. "Dinner's ready." He wiped grease and sawdust from his hands with an old shop rag, taking a moment to steady himself before walking into the kitchen. It struck him how different the space felt now. Not because they'd renovated anything, the peeling paint and outdated cabinets were still there, but because the air between them had shifted. This was their table, in their kitchen, in the house they had decided to fight for instead of flee from. They had both stood on the edge of losing everything, and the effort to step back from that edge had changed them. He sat down across from her. Maren placed a plate of simple, home-cooked food in front of him, something she'd made without pretense or performance. For months, even the most ordinary acts between them had carried a hidden tension, a question mark. Now, the silence that settled between them wasn't avoidance, it was peace. They weren't the same couple they had been before the drama unfolded. You couldn't walk through a fire and come out unchanged. But they had survived, and the survival itself became a shared bond. "How was your day?" Maren asked, settling into her seat with a sigh that sounded more content than tired. "Good," Felix replied, surprising himself with how easily the word came out. "Rick wants me to help train some new guys at the gym. Says my whole situation has inspired a few husbands to start taking boxing seriously." Maren let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "The Felix Rourke method of marriage counseling?" He smirked. Something like that. Apparently, hitting a heavy bag is cheaper than therapy. They ate in a comfortable quiet, the kind where a glance or a small smile said more than any long-winded conversation. Outside their window, the soft glow of neighbors' porch lights blinked to life one by one. Kids' voices drifted faintly through the cool evening air. Someone's barbecue grill clicked shut. Life went on in that steady, unremarkable way that used to annoy him. Now it felt grounding. Felix's phone buzzed. He glanced down and saw a message from Sophie, flying home next weekend. Can't wait to see you both. He handed the phone to Maren. Her face brightened as she read it. Their daughter had been furious at first, furious at the public mess, the rumor mill, the idea that her parents were dragging their marriage through the digital mud. But in time, she'd grown to understand that relationships were rarely as simple as the stories people told online. She's bringing someone home to meet us, Maren said, her voice lowering as though she were sharing a state secret. Some boy from her economics class. Felix raised an eyebrow. Should I be worried? Probably, she said with a small, teasing smile. But that's what fathers are for. Felix laughed, a warm, genuine laugh that filled the kitchen and startled him with its unfamiliarity. It had been a long time since their home had echoed with that sound. Not everything was perfect. They still went to counseling twice a month. They still stumbled over old resentments like furniture in the dark. But they were doing the work together, step by uneven step. And, for the first time in a long time, Felix believed they might actually make it. Later that evening, after dishes were washed and lights dimmed, they stood side by side in the bathroom. The mirror reflected two people who had weathered a storm and were still learning how to exist in the calm afterward. Maren paused, staring at her own reflection as if studying a stranger. Felix, she said softly, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found out about Lance? If you'd just ignored the signs and waited for me to figure it out myself? Felix leaned against the doorway, considering. He had asked himself versions of that question on more sleepless nights than he could count. I think you would have figured it out eventually, he said finally. You're too smart to stay fooled forever. But I might have lost a lot more money first, she said, with a dry laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. And you might have lost your wife. I almost lost my wife anyway, Felix admitted, the truth landing between them with quiet weight. Maren turned fully toward him, her expression soft but steady. But you didn't. We're still here. Yeah, Felix said, pulling her into his arms, feeling the familiar shape of her, yet noticing it with new appreciation. We're still here. Outside their bedroom window, the neighborhood settled into silence. Behind every closed door were families dealing with their own hidden battles, arguments whispered late at night, hopes cautiously nurtured, promises broken or repaired. Felix and Maren had finally stopped pretending their marriage was immune to that kind of complexity. They'd learned that marriage wasn't about never messing up. It was about staying at the table, choosing each other again, even when fear or anger made it tempting to walk away. It was about looking at the wreckage someone else caused and deciding to build something stronger from what remained. As Felix reached over and turned off the bedside lamp, he thought back to the man he'd been 3 months ago, standing alone in his garage, fists clenched, heart pounding with betrayal, ready to burn everything down just to feel in control again. That man had been all fury and wounded pride, convinced that revenge would heal a wound that actually needed honesty and courage to close. Now, Felix understood something far quieter but far more powerful. The best way to win wasn't to destroy the people who hurt you. It was to make sure they didn't have the power to shape who you became. He lay back, eyes closing, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of Maren's breathing beside him. She shifted closer, unconsciously seeking warmth, and he felt a quiet sense of gratitude settle in his chest. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new challenges, new opportunities to choose patience instead of resentment, openness instead of fear, love instead of retaliation. But tonight, this quiet moment, this fragile but real peace, was enough.